Shall we get going? I'm Brad Howlett. I lead a team called the Beneficial Biodiversity Team at Plant and Food Research in Lincoln. Our focus of research is on creating diversity of beneficial insects, so pollinators and natural enemies. So those insects that attack pests are our key target insects that we want to promote on farms. Our interest is in habitats to support these insects, as well as understanding the life cycles of the beneficial insects. So can we provide habitats on farms that support the whole life stages of the insects? So native plants are a useful tool in terms of providing nectar and floral resources to the adult stages, which are pollinators and natural enemies. Often the adult stages require nectar and pollen. So they're something that we're focusing on in our research. So let's see. So this project is a 5-year project. It is a Sustainable Food Fibres Futures funded project with MPI. We have a wide range of partners that are supporting the project. They involve primary industries, various companies and organisations like the Foundation for Arable Research, PAMU, Southern Pastures, Beef and Lamb, Synlait. We've also got councils on board, so the regional councils, ECAN and local, so the Selwyn District Council, and then people that are focused on establishing the native plants. So we've got trusts like Te Ara Kakariki and also Brailsford. And our project is focused on the Canterbury Plains. The Canterbury Plains, as you can see from this picture, is a very intensive agricultural region. There's a very simplified landscape, very little native vegetation, remnant vegetation left, less than 0.5%. So in these sorts of habitats, globally, in similar habitats as well, there's just a real lack of diversity. So in these systems, what farmers often need to rely on is inputs. So for pollinators, that's honeybees. So bringing in honeybees to pollinate crops. For farmers that need to control pests, that's the use of insecticides. There is a movement in Canterbury, though, for re-establishing habitats. And the reasons for doing this are really variable. So some farmers are particularly interested in increasing biodiversity, for example, shelter and shade for their crops and their livestock, protecting waterways. Even some farmers consider establishing plantings for pollinators and natural enemies as well. Now, this data comes from a questionnaire that we're running. It's addresses there. We would really, really value your thoughts in what drives you to establish native plantings. By filling in the survey, there's opportunities for us to send information as it comes available to you as well. But for, being able to deliver the project out to as many people as we can, doing these types of questionnaires is really valuable for us, and it can see how successful our project has been overall in terms of feedback. Okay, so the next slide is a very simple network. So it's kind of typical for a very intensive agriculture. You have an input such as managed honeybees that is relied on to pollinate crops. So in this example, it's a honeybee and it interacts with the crops, it pollinates those crops, and I've just put 2 in there, for example, brassica and carrot. Now, if you only have one pollinator, if you lose that pollinator, then it's a bit of a disaster. You're just not going to get pollination of the crop. So the crops will fail. So having a system like this is really vulnerable to any sort of factors that might limit the effectiveness of the honeybee. So, and it may not be that the honeybees may be there, but they might be going to a crop that they prefer in the environment, and so they're not pollinating the crop, or the weather could be really highly variable. So honeybees don't like flying under cool, cloudy conditions, so that will also limit them. However, a range of other insects will pollinate crops. So we've got various flies and bee species that can contribute pollination to these crops. So if you lose the honeybee, for example, out of the crop, you've got all of these other insects that contribute to the pollination. Some of these pollinators will be active at times when honeybees aren't. They prefer the cloudy, cool conditions. So by promoting these other insects to get that diversity up, it increases overall resilience. Another aspect is that honeybees, even though they're heavily relied on for pollination, and they're really, if you want to do large target management of pollination services, the honeybee is the most reliable thing to have at this stage. But some of these insects are actually better pollinators. So you've got our native bees that can be more effective pollinators of certain crops, and flies are particularly valuable pollinators of hybrid seed crops, more so than honeybees. So trying to get these insects into the system is a really sort of valuable thing to aim for. Now, I've just given these examples of pollinators. Of course, the same thing applies to natural enemies as well. If you've got one natural enemy and you lose that natural enemy, then that is problematic in terms of pest outbreaks. But if you've got a diversity of natural enemies, that means that there's something there that can help control pest species. So our focus insects in this project are crop pollinators and natural enemies as well. So we've got a wide range of insects that pollinate our crops. As I mentioned before, we've got bees and flies, beetles in certain circumstances that all contribute to crop pollination. And it's not just related to the crops that we grow here in Canterbury on these more arable farms. A lot of other systems also can benefit from biodiversity. So, for example, kiwi fruit, there's a range of insects that pollinate that crop, as can be seen in that figure there. This shows how many pollen grains the different insects deliver to the stigmas of kiwi fruit. Kiwi fruit needs a high degree of pollination. So all of the seeds that you see in a kiwi fruit, they're all a result of successful pollination. So it's not just the delivery of a single or a few pollen grains. You need hundreds of pollen grains to be delivered to the flowers. You can see in this figure that honeybees in the yellow deliver pretty well. But there's some insects there, particularly our native bees, that actually deliver more pollen as they visit the flowers than honeybees. And you can see in those green bars, we've got various flies that also deliver pollen to the flowers. In terms of kiwi fruit, though, even though there's a range of insects that will pollinate the crop, it doesn't produce nectar. So all these insects are after the pollen, so they'll feed on the pollen, whether they give it to the larvae, such as bees do, or whether they consume it themselves. So there's certain insects that are typical pollinators won't visit kiwi fruit. So in terms of developing plantings that are going to support these insects, you may want to focus on plants that are going to support these types of insects, so the hoverflies and the bee species. If we go to avocado, now this is a real contrast. Firstly, avocado doesn't produce a lot of pollen, so most insects don't deliver much pollen to the stigmas of avocado. In most cases, or many cases, a visit doesn't result in any pollen being delivered to the flower. And generally, a lot of insects can pollinate it, but it takes multiple visits to get, pollen onto the stigma. In contrast to the kiwi fruit, um, avocado produces nectar. So there's a bunch of other insects that will visit the flowers of avocado that won't visit kiwi fruit. So we've got blowflies, for example, are pollinators of avocado, but they're not attracted to kiwi fruit. Another important thing to note is that avocado flowers earlier than kiwi fruit. So we don't tend to get some of our native bees on the flowers like Lioproctus because it's just too early for them to be out and about at that time of the year. They're still in the ground. A lot of our native bees are ground nesting bees that often nest in native habitat where the soil's undisturbed, but their activity is generally from late spring through to early autumn. So it's a bit limited. White clover pollinators are also restricted. So largely this is just bees. So bee species have the ability to open the flower. So clover needs to be open to be pollinated. So we've got honeybees, bumblebees that contribute to pollination. Some of our native bees contribute. Lioproctus bees are actually really effective pollinators. You can see in that photo in the bottom left. Now, these are effective because with clover, clover needs cross-pollen. So it needs pollen from another plant to pollinate it. So Lioproctus will just visit one or two florets in a flower before moving to another plant. So it's delivering a high proportion of cross-pollen as it moves between plants. Honeybees, in contrast, tend to visit a lot of florets in the one inflorescence. And so that means that they're more likely to transfer self-pollen. So that's just an example of where a particular species can be more efficient than another just by the way it moves, basically, and how it delivers the pollen. Okay, just a few examples of some beneficial insects that we're really targeting. So there's a few hoverflies that are actually both pollinators and have maggots that attack pest species. So here we've got the small hoverfly. We call it the New Zealand orange hoverflies. It's a native species. It's as an adult form, it will pollinate crops, but it also visits a wide range of native plants as well. Then it lays its eggs on a range of plant material, and those maggots go around and eat some really significant pests, such as diamondback moth caterpillars, the eggs of cabbage white butterflies, and various aphid species. Another one is a ginger blister fly. Now, just I've never actually pointed it out, but a lot of flies, I mean, flies often get a bad rap, but in terms of natural enemies, like they're right up there, in terms of helping control pest species. So with the ginger blister fly, excellent pollinator as an adult, visits a range of native plant species, lays its eggs on perina moth, which is a pasture pest. So another really great one that we're targeting that native plantings can support. And then another example is the brown lacewing. Now with this, the adult and the larvae both attack aphids. In natives, they'll attack native aphids on these plant species. Then so you're supporting a population on your farm or on your property. Then they'll go on and attack pest species when they're present in crops or the surrounding landscape. So to our project, so we're looking at a wide range of farms. This is early on in the project. It's expanded across even more farms now. We're comparing older native plantings that have been established with new native plantings to get an idea of how long it takes for native plantings to support beneficial insects and their services. we're also comparing bare fence lines on those farms, and also control farms where there haven't been any native plants established. So a lot of the results I'll be presenting are based on those various treatments: old native plantings, new native plantings, bare fence lines, and control bare fence lines on the farms without plantings. So to the methods that we're using, various trapping methods and sweep netting around native plantings as a whole. So these go out around those various treatments with the bare fence lines, control farms, and around native plantings. Then our sweep nettings are being conducted around the native plantings and then out in the middle of the field to get an idea of, okay, what are the differences between bare fence lines and native plantings, and is that translating to an effect out in the field in terms of diversity? In the middle is the pitfall traps. We did this for the first year. I won't present data at this talk for those. So as well as looking at those insects associated with around the native plantings, we're also trialing crop plants to see whether those beneficial insects are affected in terms of whether they're present on these crop plants, and what sort of services they're delivering. So we're noting down, okay, what insects are going to the brassica here in this case. Then we're noting the seed set. So we're doing some hand pollination to be able to see what's the maximum yield that we can get, and then comparing that with flowers that have been visited by these insects around these various treatments, so that we can see, okay, is there a gap in the yield? Can native plants have an effect in terms of increasing crop yield? We're also looking at kale in a similar way. So we put those out over several weeks, and we've been noting the pests and the beneficial insects associated with that kale over time. So those trials that we're doing are based on the native plants per se. We want to also know how different plant species, what they're attracting. Are they attracting the right sorts of insects? Are they attracting a diverse array of insects? So we're looking at a wide range of native plant species to see how effective they are in terms of attracting those insects, or being a site that those insects can utilize. So we're observing the plants, and we're also beating the foliage to get an idea of what other beneficial insects might be on the plants. So going to some results. So in terms of our window traps, we've got 2 years data here at 2021, 22, 22, 23. Overall, we're seeing old mixed natives having high diversity and high abundances of insects. So where the traps are placed near there, we're getting pretty good catches and diverse catches. New mixed natives are pretty good as well. Bare fence lines are less overall. You can see there, we also put some traps around old flax and new flax sites. And you can see in 2022, 23, that the results are highly different to the 21, 22. We put that down to the flax being in flower at the time. So it would have been attracting a high abundances of insects to it at that time. The traps were out. Our sweep netting is also showing a trend in terms of more diversity, higher numbers of beneficial insects around the old mixed natives, followed by the new mixed natives, more so than the treatment bare fence and control bare fence lines. So really sort of consistent pattern developing there. So that's adjacent to these features. When we go into the middle of the field, though, we're not seeing it translate further out. So it seems to be quite a localized effect. So one of the questions that we need to think about is, okay, how effective are native plants in terms of being able to translate on a farm scale and at a more regional scale in terms of their effectiveness in supporting beneficial insects? This figure here, it looks complex. It's a network diagram. So what it shows on the left, and this is the pak choi data, so the insects visiting the pak choi. On the left, we've got the various insects that we saw visiting the pak choi. On the right, we've got the various treatments, so control farms, bare fence lines, the new native plantings, old native plantings. In this case, we also looked at garden. So you can see there the red, that's the native bees. What we're seeing there is generally higher abundances of the native bees visiting the pak choi flowers at the old plantings and at the gardens, and a little bit more there in the new plantings versus the bare fence lines and control farms. The numbers, so the average number of taxa visiting, you can see there that old plantings were getting more diverse or more species visiting the flowers, so 8.2 on average, compared to, say, control farms 4.3. So we're seeing an increased diversity, and the overall thickness of the right-hand side, so if you look at the old plantings, that is quite a thick bar. That just shows the abundances overall. So the old plantings are actually supporting more diverse and more abundant insects visiting the crop. And this also shows individual farms. Just basically what we're seeing is a fairly consistent trend across farms with the various treatments, with the native plantings compared to the bare fence lines and the control bare fence lines. So what that means is that if you establish native plantings, for example, our data's pointing to you're going to have an effect that's beneficial in terms of pollination or supporting pollinators to the flowers. Now, when we look at the seed set on the pak choi, on the brassica, the yield near the old native plantings is high, it's essentially the same as when you hand pollinate. So we're not seeing any yield deficit. So that's a really great result there. The new natives, in their first year, there was a yield deficit. In year 2, we didn't see a yield deficit. In the bare fence line and control farms, we've seen yield deficits in both years. So there's something really positive of an actual demonstration of a beneficial effect that native plantings on farms can provide to pollination services in surrounding or next to the native plantings. Going to the kale, which we also put out. Now, this is an interesting slide with the kale pests. So those pink colors, so that sort of more purpley pink and the salmon pink, they represent white butterfly. So the sort of the purpley pink is caterpillars, the salmon pink is the eggs. So the eggs have been laid, they're not actually doing damage to the plant, but we've got a lot of eggs being laid on the old mixed native, which sounds really bad. But if you take that dominant salmon pink out, the data between the various treatments is actually pretty similar. So this is hinting that a lot of eggs are being lost before they turn into larvae. So that's yeah, an interesting result. But if we look at the natural enemies, the old mixed natives, new mixed natives have more natural enemies associated with them. So they're probably consuming those eggs and keeping the outbreak of insects down somewhat. When we look at the parasitism of the white butterflies, what we're seeing is that at control farm bare fence and the bare fence on the farms where natives have been established, we're getting really sort of variable results from farm to farm in terms of how many of the caterpillars are parasitized. In the new mixed natives, we actually got very high consistent parasitism, apart from that line that's down near the 0, which essentially was eaten by cows, so you can exclude that. And the old mixed natives, also, you know, there's a trend of more of the caterpillars being parasitized when they're near the old mixed natives compared to bare fence line and control bare fence lines. Okay, moving to the final part. So we've seen some really positive effects around associated with native plantings. But what we want to know is which native plantings should we be planting? And it's going to be what you're targeting. So if we can understand what plants are associated with what insects, then there's potential to design that habitat to select certain plant species. So here, these are the plant species that we've looked at so far. We're looking at species that are flowering throughout the year, as can be seen in those orange bars. So what we want to see, okay, if we want to put out a native plant or establish a native plantings, can we look after the insects over a long period of time by providing nectar and pollen resources over a long period of time by mixing up the plant species? So to do that, what we need is these plant species to support those similar insect species over time, and preferably support a diverse range of beneficial insects. And yeah, here's some of the just tallies that we're getting. So in 2010, based on literature and some early observation surveys, the data was not, it was showing some species supported a diversity of beneficial insects. But since we've gone into these more detailed surveys, we're actually finding really quite high diversity of insects being supported. And you've got to consider that this is Canterbury. Canterbury has got hardly any remnant vegetation left. So this is, I find this quite remarkable that native plantings in this sort of environment can support these sorts of numbers of species in this region. This is showing the network. So as I showed the plants and their flowering times going down, this network has got that same order. So the plants at the top of the network on the left-hand side flower early spring, right through summer, and then down at the bottom is a winter flowering five-finger. So what you can see here that in 2013, we only knew of 73 interactions. Our observations have so far shown 530 interactions. But what this network shows is not just complexity, but it's showing that, you know, we're supporting interactions of these beneficial insects right throughout the year. That's sort of demonstrated in that really complex tangle. If the tangle was sort of concentrated in the upper year, then that wouldn't be really great because that means you'd be only supporting the insects at that time. But because we've managed to get it consistent, then that's a really good sign that we can support these insects over a long period of time. Breaking it down just to hoverflies. So hoverflies, a number of those species that I pointed out, like the orange hoverfly and the black hoverfly, have got predatory larvae. So they're pollinators and natural enemies. This shows here, again, the plant species on the left and the various hoverfly species on the right. And it highlights the orange hoverflies, for example, black hoverflies, well, a lot of them are visiting the flowers of a lot of these plant species throughout the year. So it sort of highlights if you establish a whole range of these plant species, then you're providing nectar and pollen resources for these plant species that will support them on your farm throughout the year. The other aspect that we're interested in is site. So if you've got a particular site and you're sort of wondering, okay, well, maybe my site might be very different to another site. Maybe I won't get the same sorts of insects that I'm targeting on my site just because it's, you know, the farm is in a different location to another farm. What we're demonstrating is a lot of these insects are actually really common. If you establish native plantings, then there's a real high probability you're going to get these beneficial insects no matter what. So you can see there the black hoverfly, for example, seen at every site. recorded at every site and pretty common at pretty much all of the sites. So there's a bit of variation site by site that may be influenced by the landscape features. Blue hoverfly, for example, has aquatic larvae, and you can see that one of the lines very thick down to the DOR site at the bottom. So that's about 5th in. And we think that's associated with a dam on site. So the larvae are probably being supported there, where other sites don't have a dam, so they're not being supported in those sorts of numbers. But overall, you can see there that there's a really high probability that these insects could play a good part, on your property. Plant beating results. So here we're getting insects that we wouldn't see visiting flowers, things like the lacewings. Generally, this data is still preliminary. This year, we're going to go through with more samples. And what we're seeing again is that these plant species are supporting these insects over time as well. So brown lacewings, here we're seeing some of the later data that we've collected supporting brown lacewing on crops that are flowering or present earlier in the season as well, even though this figure appears that as though the later flowering plants are supporting it more so. So yeah, early days, but it's demonstrating that a lot of native plants also support beneficial insects besides those that are flower visitors. So what are we going to do with this, and what can we do with this data? So the earlier data that we're using for window traps, sweep netting, where we're measuring the services to crops, is demonstrating a beneficial effect on all of those things. Other places in the world have indicated a similar trend, but others haven't. So it's really variable depending where you are. We think that by understanding the insects associated with these in different plant species, we can design habitat that's going to be targeted for specific crops. So it might be that you'll pick certain species if you're growing kiwi fruit, for example, different species for avocado. So we think that if we can target the right plant mix for what the farmer needs, then there's potential to deliver these services more efficiently. And this is what we're doing with kiwi fruit at the moment in the North Island. So this is based on literature database and database searches and quite reasonably limited observations of native plant species. The pollinators in this network are down the bottom of kiwi fruit. So all of those are kiwi fruit pollinators. So what we want to do is pick those plant species at the top that are showing that their support, the highest numbers of species of kiwi fruit pollinators. So the thicker the bar, so you can see at the very furthest top point along, that's kiwi fruit itself. Because all of these insects are kiwi fruit pollinators, all the bars, all of the connections go down to all of those pollinators. So things like Carnuka there have got a thick, support most of these pollinators based on that thick black bar at the top. So that means we can select species that are going to flower throughout the year, and also those that support the most kiwi fruit pollinators. And that's what we're doing here. So these are designed native plantings for kiwi fruit that we've established at sites in the Bay of Plenty. So those kiwi fruit sites we're monitoring over time to see what the effects are, to verify it. But overall, based on this information, we've come up with a roadmap that we've published, which has 5 steps to follow in terms of designing habitat to support farms or pollination of certain crops, or support natural enemies, for example, is what you could also do with this. So the key thing is to know what you're targeting, step 1. Step 2 is which are the native plants or plant species that are going to support your target insects. Step 3 is to look at which are the ones that support the richest ones, when are they going to flower. Step 4 is what's your site like? So can you establish everything, or is your site limited? Do you need to consider plant species that are low growing because you got overhead irrigation, for example? Is your site dry? So you're going to choose plant species that are best suited to that site. And step 5 is just to see, okay, are you improving yields? Are you controlling pests better? The other thing that we want to do too, and we think we can do with this data, is look at remnant habitat. So on certain farms, there is remnant habitat across New Zealand. A lot of people don't know what that means in terms of the services to farms. Well, we think if we understand the plant species made up in that remnant habitat, we can get an idea of what sort of beneficial insects are associated with that habitat. So we've been sort of starting to do that. This is an example of dry woodland, a prediction on the Canterbury Plains of the insects that dry woodland plant species are going to support in terms of beneficial insects. Okay, so we're to the final slide. So what do we want to get out of this work? So we want landholders and communities to know that there's a wide range of insects that are beneficial. It's not just honeybees, for example, for pollination. We've got flies, we've got native bees that we need to look after if we want to have resilient systems. We want to provide the industry bodies, councils with tools to be able to promote habitats and promote designed habitats that will suit the farm. And then from the information, we hope that we, with our end users, with people that want to establish native plantings that pollinate or looking after beneficial insect biodiversity is a key driver for them to establish that sort of habitat on their property. Okay, so I'll leave it there, and thanks a lot, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Brad.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This facility is awesome. If you ask a question, he can hear you. So just talk up loud, and then is there any questions? Yep.
Yeah, Brad, you mentioned in one slide in the middle there that the middle of a paddock, there was less effect from the native plantings. I'm just kind of wondering, in terms of distance, what is the sort of area of effect of native plantings?
Okay. Yeah, so this is something that's still outstanding as a question. So there's other elements that we need to consider further down the track, and that is not only, I mean, we know certain insects are capable of moving there, but will they move there? Do they need to move there? I mean, it's a bit like if you've got a supermarket nearby, do you go to the further away supermarket? You might be capable of getting there, but you're not going to go there. So it's still a mystery about what are the drivers to get insects out, say, into the middle of the field. We haven't looked at big scale crops yet. And that's something else that we would like to do. But there may well also be that the size of the planting will have an effect as well, and the shape of the planting. So it's all a bit of a mystery. We need to do a bit more of a look at gradients over different types of native habitats to see what the effects are.
Any other questions?
Is all this information available on the internet or some way,
Yep.
some of them graphs?
Yeah,
Yep.
it's been recorded, and you'll get a recording of it.
Right.
And
Yeah.
Brad might even give us a copy of his talk.
Yeah, and if you fill in the questionnaire, we'll be sending all our updates through those. If people want information, there's an opportunity in the questionnaire to provide your email, and we'll be sending through material there as well.
Hi, Brett. Thank you very much. I'm just interested in about why did you take the winter flowering trees out, because from pest management point of view, it's always related to how you start the season with the amount of beneficial insects, because they breed so much slower than your pests. So why do you take those out?
Sorry, I didn't quite understand.
I saw in one of your slides that you looked at from September, I think, till May or June, you looked at the flowering species of natives. I'm just inquisitive of why would you take the winter ones out? Because that's always what I used to do, is plant for winter flowering, so I got
Yeah.
more. Yep, go
Okay.
on.
Yeah. So the winter, like when I showed the winter network, I mean, essentially those are in the system. So we would encourage establishing native plantings in the winter to support those insects as far along as possible. So I've also had the question of exotics and whether they play a role and whether maybe they could also provide nectar and pollen. But I mean, these are sort of topics that we need to explore. But I would very much advocate, you know, things like five finger that are demonstrating to support a range of insects during winter to be part of that planting. My thoughts are that you need to connect as many plants together so that they flower in sequence, so the plants don't lose their resources. There's debate over whether you should, you know, if you've got a target plant that is flowering at a certain time, maybe you might want to avoid plants that are flowering at the same time to avoid competition. But there needs to be work done in that space in terms of what that means.
Any other questions? Ollie?
Do you feel that silviculture will take over on the Canterbury Plains and elsewhere through your research?
Silviculture. I don't think, I mean, I think that, I mean, hard to answer anything on that level. I mean, we're targeting our end user crops here in the Canterbury. So we're focused on providing the habitat that's going to pollinate arable crops or control pest species that are pasture pests. So anything else could be part of the mix, but we're not looking at the future of Canterbury apart from the crops that are being grown now.
So my question is, Brad, have you thought about, you know, insect abundance, and have you actually gone to a place like here where we are, where 50% of the land mass is in native forest, and find out, is there a massively higher number of beneficial and pollinating insects when there is a lot of native bush around?
Yeah, so I think that is a really valuable thing, and I would love to do it. I mean, one thing that we've got to consider that this is early days, and also it's very regional centered. This is an SFF, so we need to get the buy-in of industries to support the project. So unfortunately, at this point in time, we would need to get the buy-in of organizations or find some source of funding to be able to do that research. But it's a good step looking at this more intensive system. I would predict that you would have pretty good diversity, but don't forget there's also those other inputs that go in that can affect diversity. So in kiwi, for example, passion vine hopper is a problem. Passion vine hopper will feed on and complete life cycles on certain native plant species. So we've got to also consider those aspects as well. But it would be really nice to be able to look at some more diversified sites to see what sort of effect it's having on beneficial insects.
Are there any other questions? I personally will be poring over those graphs to try and work out how to get rid of my white butterfly. And there is a paper also that I'll send through, which I read of Brad's, which is fascinating, and it actually does look at the density of insect visits to all sorts of different plants And I seem to remember the hebe came out really well. In terms
Yeah,
of
yeah. Yeah, so there's a whole range of plant species that for the system that we're looking at are, excellent. So there's a heap. So you've got Carnuka, Manuka, Hebes are really, really super. Then we've got cabbage trees are great. Yeah, a whole range of them. But just a tip, just to get an idea, just observe some flowers and see if you see them and you're fascinated by the numbers of insects. Usually that's a pretty good indicator that, they're supporting a diversity of insects.
I don't know about the rest of you, but I go outside my house and at certain times of the year, and the buzz, the hum, like a hum, continual hum in this valley is amazing. Kate, do you want to talk a bit about your bit of work you're doing with insects?
Right.
Or ask a question?
I could talk individually about what I'm doing with the insects, but I mean, one of the things that I am really enjoying about this whole work is that when I'm working and doing planting with tamariki, is that I say we're not planting trees, we're planting habitat. And it is this sort of data that's coming out that's actually backing that up. I mean, I think we probably know it already, but it's good to have it to be helping our industries as well to be moving forward on this. And yes, just from a point of view from the biodiversity group, I really would like to say thank you so much for giving us the time today. I think we are very, very grateful for what you've shared with us. So thank you.
Thank you. So Brad, we're going to go and have a highly unwanted gossip. But we will all be looking at our plants quite differently and insect farming and going through the report because there's some amazing graphs. We just need to sit there and study them.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. I'd love to have been there. Would have been great to join you for the barbie and do the tour of the trees.
Well, I'm sure you're welcome anytime you're passing through. I'm sure Hannah would be happy to show you. And there'd be quite a few other people that would love you to come to their properties too. Yeah. Okay, it's just the final thank you for Brad.
Yeah, thanks for listening too. It's great to be able to get this information out. Thanks a lot.
And I'm sure they'll all fill in the survey because I've sent it out once.
Yeah,
but now
send in the surveys, the more the better. Yeah, we need to make sure our information gets out there.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Well, thank you all for coming. Great to see so many people coming out here. There will be a list coming out here in a minute that we're going to organize some events in the future as well. We had last week here like a film screening of 6 inches of soil. We will do more often. These kind of things are slowly coming in the next year or two. If you want to be on the mailing list, there will be a list of there. Write your name on the email list so we can give you updates if there's anything happening here on the farm. Thank you for coming. Thank you.
Thanks.